Well, folks, here we are, the end of the course. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about contemporary archaeologies. It's a topic I'm really excited about and have actually actively engaged in research about. But I also think it's important to recognize the journey that we've been through this term, and I don't want to back end the course with a lot more new content. So instead, I thought I would post this piece just to get you thinking about where do we go from here? Now that you have some foundation and some basics of archaeology, what does it actually look like in the real world? What could it look like in the real world? And I think importantly for you folks, what could archaeology look like in a post-COVID world? So you recall that in week 2, way back when we were talking about what archaeology is, I talked about 4 major types of archaeology. I talked about academic archaeology, archaeology in industry, indigenous archaeologies, and then pseudo-archaeology as well. And now I want to add in a 5th category, which is archaeologies of the contemporary. And these take a whole bunch of different forms. And I could talk about all of these equally, and each of these could have their own course. But I wanted to focus on a few that I think are interesting. So this is where my own bias is going to come into play. And note that technically speaking, studies of contemporary waste or garbology would fall under this as well. So what are some archaeologies of the contemporary? Well, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but some of them can be referred to as activist, action, applied, public, and or collaborative archaeology. So technically cultural heritage management would fall under this. But there's also been archaeologies that have looked at how the information we know about climate change in the past and the human causes of change in our world, both the physical world, the climatic world, our plant and animal environments, so all of those different things, basically what we call now the Anthropocene, how this can inform us to move forward and hopefully move ahead in a world that isn't plagued by some of the problems we're faced with today. Other archaeologies have focused on other groups that have been made invisible through their lack of representation and lack of discourse about them in the archaeological record. So we can refer to them broadly as the disenfranchised, the voiceless, and the invisible. A really interesting emergent field of this is the archaeology of homelessness, and looking at the homeless as a marginalized community that is present, particularly in cities, but isn't actually captured or represented in archaeological reports or accounts of the past. So how do we account for people who are part of our society but are made invisible in a contemporary setting? How can we account for this in our telling of the archaeological past as well, and how can we find and look for homelessness in the archaeological record? Undocumented migration is another thing. So looking at the movement of people into new areas, how can we see that? I'm going to talk a little bit about archaeologies of inclusion. Of course, this question of what does a post-COVID-19 archaeology look like? This I'm put under forensic and disaster archaeology, but I think it also then relates to kind of looking forward in terms of how are we going to account for and address and consider the material culture that we have today. And then there's a whole bunch of other kind of contemporary archaeologies, and the ones I've selected are all ones that are actually challenging what archaeology is explicitly. And so if you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to take a course like 395, which I regularly teach, because we spend a lot of time talking about these contemporary archaeologies and these challenges to archaeology, because I fundamentally believe that we can make archaeology a better place for everyone, and I firmly also believe that archaeology is an extremely valuable discipline with very practical, real applications to the real world outside of the academy as well. So one that of the first kind of archaeologies that was very contemporary, at least for me, when I was going through my journey as an archaeologist, was something called punk archaeology. It has its origins, as I state here, in 2008. Online, it was initially through a blog and then a lot of discourse on Twitter. It hasn't been as talked about as much recently, but I think it's still important because this was where these archaeologists were looking at some of the parallels that existed between punk culture and archaeology. And this is so neat because it maintains some parts of archaeology as it is, archaeology as being collaborative, archaeology as having a very strong DIY or do-it-yourself initiative, but then also challenging how archaeology, has to be this kind of idea of this like political neutral thing, which it isn't and never has been, that archaeology should be public. So they started holding unconferences, basically things in pubs where people would get together to talk about archaeology and sing songs about archaeology and yell about archaeology. So kind of breaking out of this stuffy notion of academic archaeology and challenging what it could be. Also, and very importantly, utilizing the internet, looking at how archaeological information could be open access, could be distributed, could be raw. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I'll admit that my videos this term have a little bit of that punk ethos in that I haven't been editing them, right? I've just been lecturing to you through these videos the same way I would be in a classroom. So my stumbles and mispronunciations and missteps are all here and captured because archaeology is dirty and messy. And we don't always capture that when we're teaching it and when we're talking about it. And there's this passion that comes with punk archaeology as well that I think is really critical and important. And something that was talked about, they talked about in these early days of punk archaeology as well is protest and the importance of that as archaeologists, we have this unique opportunity to use our voices as experts to say things that are meaningful, that have value. So, they talk about it being kind of irreverent, but also a very relevant movement in archaeology. Of course, it's very critical of the classism that is found in archaeology. So it represents other anxieties that we have around the discipline as a whole. One of the proponents of punk archaeology is also behind something that recently has gained a lot of attention and is something that I'm actively engaged in as a research community, which is archaeogaming. And so this is an emerging field of study in the last 10 years. A lot of publications have come out in the last 5, I would say in particular, including I posted on Blackboard for you 2 of my articles that have come out in the last year alone. And what it is it's how it has its origins initially looking at how we can kind of do archaeology in video games and kind of be archaeologists in video games, or looking at representations of archaeologists in video games. And now it's expanded to looking at how we can actually apply the methods and theories of archaeology to virtual worlds and environments, right? So there's a whole bunch of different ways we could approach this. I actually do a lot more of an alternative form of archaeogaming that is very much grounded in this kind of idea of applying archaeological theory to digital technologies and digital artifacts in particular. So we have a whole bunch of different ways that we can study the material culture of the immaterial, but also study immaterial culture itself, right? Or what we might call digital culture or digital artifacts. So again, a very interesting, dynamic, emerging field of archaeology with a very large online community, or I shouldn't say very large. It's actually really small. But in my opinion, it's a dynamic, at least, online community. Something else that I think you might have picked up this term that I'm very passionate about is about inclusivity and actually what we might call EDI more broadly, which is equity, inclusion, and diversity. And so there's been a lot of work coming out of, interestingly, the UK in particular, looking at how we can make archaeology more inclusive, because there are so many structural barriers present in archaeology, including the accessibility of post-secondary education. So why do we only teach archaeology primarily in universities? Why are we not teaching more children about archaeology as a discipline younger on? Why is it not part of core curricula in the same kind of ways to make it more accessible to people, but also the kind of physicality that is seen and expected of archaeology, this idea that you have to go somewhere and you have to dig and you have to be out in the field, and how this can be very limiting to many individuals. It can represent a barrier physically. Also concerns around how archaeology has not always been the greatest place for cognitive disorders, for other mental health issues, but also for like learning disorders and stuff like that as well. So the goal of these kind of archaeologies is to make archaeology, as I mentioned, more inclusive, more diverse, and also accessible to a wider range of people. And honestly, this is part of the reason why I'm really excited about archaeogaming, because basically the major limitation of doing archaeogaming is access to technology. And increasingly, that's a barrier that is being removed, right? So for some individuals, this is great because it no longer requires that physical component of someone going into a field environment. The field is in the internet, right? So as long as they have the right tools, they can now do this. And like I said, getting a laptop and some software might be a bit more accessible, or paying for a game, for example, or a subscription fee might be more accessible to some people, and might be more from even a financial perspective than getting some sort of accommodation in terms of transportation, etc. Right? And then the last one I thought I'd mention, just because this makes me really excited, but I don't know if you know, but this is the 20th anniversary of the International Space Station being inhabited by humans. So that means that for the last 20 years, and that means for some of you, you have been living for as long as people have also been living in space. Like, this is amazing. Like, this is the dream I had growing up as a child, and it's actually happening. And my daughter is now living in a time period where humans have always lived in space. Like, that's just the normal for her. My grandparents were part of a generation, they were born in the 20s and 30s, where people didn't live in space, right? They saw the first lunar landing. They saw some of the first images come back from satellite images, but they grew up in a period where we didn't actually have photographs of what space looked, or what our planet looked like from space. I grew up, fortunately, always having this idea that people went to space, that people had been in space, that we could see planetary bodies and other objects in space using the technology we have. But now my daughter, again, this next leap forward, is living in a time where people have always lived in space. So space archaeology came out of this, and there's a number of major proponents who are looking at this. So there's two approaches. So Dr. Parkak, has argued about archaeology from space, but this is kind of using space technologies to understand better terrestrial archaeological sites. Others, like Alice Gorman, and Dr. Parkak said a little bit about this, and Dr. Walsh have looked at the cultural heritage and significance of space exploration. And if you're interested in this topic, I can't recommend for you enough Dr. Gorman's book, which is just so fascinating. It provides an incredible history of space exploration from a global perspective, but focusing on the material culture component of it, and has some really provocative ideas and very thoughtful, reflexive ideas about the role archaeology can play and should play as we continue to expand our footprint into space. So I want you to think now about the factors that shape the kinds of archaeologies we do. Clearly, the archaeologies I do are grounded so much in my passion for things, right? So I like video games. So that's how I got into archaeogaming. But I really like stuff, and so that's how I got into archaeology. And I like digging. And I like to know more about human evolution, and that's why I did work in Africa. And I'm interested in technologies, and that's why I study video games and stone tools and basketry. And I'm interested in how people learn these technologies, which is why I got interested in ethnoarchaeology, right? So yeah, a lot of my motivation and who I am as a person is define the kind of archaeology I do. But then that has consequences in terms of who I am as an instructor, and then that shapes our discipline, because now you all are going forth and you're going to pave your own trails and your own ways into archaeology, and you're going to shape what it is archaeologists do, right? And I also shape then who is involved in the practice of archaeology, because if I am preaching to you about equity and diversity and inclusion, hopefully that means that people who normally would have said, hey, archaeology is not for me because of X, Y, and Z, are saying, no, wait, there is room for me in archaeology. And I guess that would be one of my biggest takeaways for you folks this term, is that I hope that if you ever had concerns about going into archaeology because of a particular reason, because of your gender, your ethnicity, your religion, your sexuality, your abilities, whatever, I hope now maybe you're thinking, well, no, actually archaeology needs me, because they need people like me to continue to make archaeology a better place by making it more diverse, right? I also want you to think about how, though, that archaeology still does have a hierarchy that's involved, that we still have these idea of credentials that are required to do archaeology, and also how we do field archaeology or dirt archaeology or meat space archaeology, as those of us in archaeogaming like to refer to it, does shape, again, the kinds of archaeology we do. We still have these expectations around survey and excavation. And again, this is going to this impacts what it is that archaeology is. And then we also have to think about something called stakeholders. And I haven't talked about this a lot, but remember that the public is part of archaeology too, because they're consuming often the products of the work we do. I mean, you see this on social media. Even if you don't follow archaeology, eventually you'll see, or archaeologists, eventually you'll see something related to archaeology pop up in your timeline or covered in a news story, because there is something inherently, I believe, interesting about our past to us as humans. So we have to think about this. We have to think about the communities in which we work. We have to think about the kinds of people we want to engage in archaeology. We have to think about the role we play in cultural resource management, for example, and how we serve the needs of industry. We have to think about governments who are regulating archaeological practice but aren't archaeologists. And so we have to think about how that's then shaping our work. So we have to think about all of these different things. And that's what we do in 395, is really get into this and critique it and interrogate it. And again, then hopefully you leave that course now further empowered to think about the archaeology that you want to do and how you want to change archaeology. In another textbook that I've often used in this course, written by a Canadian archaeologist by the name of Bob Muckle or Robert Muckle, his first or second edition of his text, the third edition, just came out, so I'm curious to see how he's changed. He argues that archaeology has a lot of benefits, and this is what he outlines. He says that archaeology is important and relevant to everyday life, right? That it's not just the old adage that, unless we know history, we're doomed to repeat it, but it's the idea that the people care about these kind of things. They're interested in the past, be it immediate or different or distant. And this is because the archaeological record itself is vast. There's so much out there we have yet to explore, to examine, to understand. I hope it's been clear through how I've presented this material that archaeology is a science, that it is firmly grounded in scientific method and theory. We also have a concern that archaeological sites are being destroyed at an alarming rate, something that is going to come up, I know, in some of our other courses, such as 399 and our special topics course next fall, 497, the Anthropocene, where we have to be aware that climate change is really, really impacting the archaeological record negatively. So not only is material culture eroding out of glaciers and glacial ice that is melting at a very fast rate, but other aspects of climate change are causing things like mudslides and all these other and transforms, right, that are impacting the archaeological record itself. Never mind the unrelentlessly rapid pace of development that is also destroying sites as well. I hope it's become clear to you that archaeology is also filled with bias, that even how I teach this course represents several of my biases, and I've tried to make those clear to you throughout the term. And this last point I just adore, which is that people have been smart for a very long time. And if you have any questions about that, take our World Prehistory course, and it will really clear up to you that humans are amazing and have been doing really incredible things for as long as we've been human. And I believe that we got ourselves into this mess, and we can also get ourselves out. So I have some further reflections. I think here in Canada, we need to think about how archaeology can serve the TRC recommendations. But in order to do this, we have to, again, be really critical about who is doing archaeology, right? So we have to make archaeology more accessible. We have to make archaeology more diverse. And part of that means we need to reconsider how and why we do archaeology, because the archaeological record is at risk. And if we continue to do what we have done before, we are going to continue to perpetuate an inequitable, unequal, colonialist archaeology that is going to not be welcoming, that is not going to be accessible to people, that is not going to be inclusionary, that is not going to get the right kinds of minds into archaeology. And by the right kind of minds, I mean all different kinds of minds, right? That there's not just one type of person who should be an archaeologist, but we need a whole bunch of different kinds of people doing archaeology to make it a great thing. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't conclude with this last point around context, right? I've argued all term that context is everything in archaeology, but I'd also encourage you to think about the role that context plays in life, right? So in the context of this COVID world that we currently live, think about some of the lessons we've learned about the value of being kinder, of slowing down a little bit, of creating space for each other, both physically, but also mentally, for recognizing that we all have challenges and that there is space for all of us to experience both sadness and grief, but also joy and passion. And we can have all of these things, and it doesn't mean that it devalues the experience of other people in our life. So we're done, or at least almost done. You have the final exam left to do. I've included some of the courses in the notes below. Of course, if you're interested in taking additional archaeology classes, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or my other colleagues in the anthropology department here, Dr. Prince, Dr. Zutter, Dr. McKenzie. All of us are willing to provide you with guidance and support as you look forward in a way into archaeology. Actually, Dr. Swanson does bioarchaeology. So again, there's a lot of us here who can assist you as you're seeking your way forward in this discipline. In terms of field schools, I don't know what field work is going to look like post-COVID-19. I will keep this Blackboard course open for the foreseeable future, and I will be posting in that discussion forum listings of field schools when I come across them. But I'd encourage you to just actively, regularly, if you really want to do a field school and get field experience, check out these lists that have been provided by the Canadian Archaeological Association and the RPA, or Register of Professional Archaeologists, as well. And again, don't hesitate to ask any questions if you have, again, questions of me about different field schools, right? But I did give a list of things you should consider when it comes to choosing a field school. So things like access to information about it. If you're not getting a lot of information, that may not bode well, but where it is, because of course where it is will impact the budget. Also be aware that there's different kinds of field schools. Some will give you university credit. Others, like research institutes, will give you really great, highly trained experiences in archaeology, but you may not be eligible for university credit. And then volunteerism is essentially where you're paying to play. So that's where you're paying your own way. You're going on a project. You're kind of basically volunteering. You're not really getting credit. And you are kind of getting one that's based on real world archaeology, and at a real archaeological site. But the idea is that they're not training you to be a real world archaeologist, that you're just there for the experience of doing archaeology. And then also think about who's involved as well. And I'd say this again, think about, in the name of equity, diversity, and inclusion, who's running these field schools, what topics they're studying, etc. Find a field school that feels ethical. And if you have questions about that, let me know. Okay, so what are we going to do then moving forward in archaeology? These things. We're going to continue to challenge and critique archaeology because we want it to be better. We're going to situate our analyses and our interpretations by, quote unquote, putting things into place, which means we need to understand the context in which our interpretations about the past are coming from. And this means that we then have to critique and challenge those. There's no such thing as one past, right? This is a false narrative. How we understand the past is determined a lot by who we are as people and what past we are attempting to understand. So what this means is that we need to come up with methods and initiatives that will allow us to go forward as a discipline as a whole. So I'm very proud of the work that you all did this term under these challenging conditions. I wish you all the best of luck as you go into your final exams. And thank you for an excellent term.